My mom was at this time on meth and heroin. Shai was on coke. I think it's environmental, I think it's genetic, and I think it's just...
Here is your completely original 4,000-word YouTube script. Script: Jelly Roll's daughter Bailee exposes the truth about her father. Most people think they know Jelly Roll's story. A man born into chaos, swallowed by the streets, and somehow clawed his way back through music. That story has been told on late-night television, on Grammy stages, in Senate hearing rooms. But there is a version of events that nobody was prepared for, and it did not come from him. It came from a 16-year-old girl who sat down in front of a microphone, took a breath, and told the world what it actually looked like inside that family. What Bailee and DeFord said was not what the tabloids wanted. It was not what the internet predicted. And if you have only heard her father's version of events, what she revealed will change the way you see everything. This is not a takedown. This is not a redemption arc packaged for streaming. This is a daughter telling the truth. And the truth turned out to be something far more complicated, far more painful, and ultimately far more powerful than anyone expected. To understand what Bailee said, and why it matters as much as it does, you have to start at the beginning. Not the beginning Jelly Roll usually tells, but the one that was happening in the background while he was still figuring out who he was going to become. Jason DeFord, the man the world now knows as Jelly Roll, was 23 years old and sitting inside the Davidson County Jail in Nashville when he got the news. A prison guard knocked on his cell door and told him his daughter had just been born. He has described that moment in more interviews than can be counted. He has called it his Damascus Road. He has said it was the first time he cried in years. He has described looking around his cell with almost nothing to his name and feeling the full weight of what it meant to be responsible for a new life while being completely incapable of showing up for it. That moment, in his telling, is the moment the story began to change. But Bailee was not born into a story. She was born into a specific situation, with a specific mother, in a specific set of circumstances that would shape the first decade of her life in ways Jelly Roll could not control from behind bars. Her mother's name is Felicia. Jelly Roll and Felicia had been in a relationship in the years before his incarceration. By the time Bailee arrived, things between them were already strained. When he was eventually released, around the time Bailee was approaching her second birthday, he met his daughter for the first time in person. What followed was not a clean reunion. It was a legal process that would stretch out across years, moving in increments, shaped by court dates and custody hearings, and the slow, grinding work of demonstrating that a man with his history was capable of being someone a child could depend on. He has talked about those years on multiple platforms. He went to court every 6 months, he has said. He pushed for expanded visitation, then partial custody, then eventually full custody. Music was not part of the equation, yet. He has been clear about that. He just wanted to be a father. He just wanted to prove that he was capable of being one. But what was happening in Bailee's daily life during all of that time? What was the household she was actually growing up in? That is where the story shifts entirely. Because the answer to that question did not come from interviews with Jelly Roll. It did not come from a documentary. It did not come from a publicist statement or a carefully managed profile in a major magazine. It came from Bailee herself, sitting across from her stepmother on a podcast called Dumb Blonde. In February of 2024, a 15-year-old girl decided she was ready to tell her own story. And what she said stopped people cold. Felicia had been present in Bailee's early life. She lived with her mother and her maternal grandparents in those first years. Then, when Bailee was still in elementary school, Felicia received a medical diagnosis: fibromyalgia. The treatment that came with it included prescription pain medication. And according to multiple accounts, including statements made in a documentary about Jelly Roll's life, that prescription was the beginning of a downward spiral that would consume years of Felicia's life and define the environment Bailee was raised in. Bailee herself has described what that decline looked like from the inside. She said the visible deterioration began when she was around kindergarten age. By first grade, she has said, things were essentially gone. The house she grew up in during those years was, in her own words, horrendous. She has said the memories from that period still gave her nightmares as a teenager. These were not vague childhood impressions or stories she was told after the fact. They were specific scenes, specific moments, specific things she witnessed and experienced that stayed with her. This is the part of Jelly Roll's story that gets smoothed over in the inspirational version. A man fighting his own battles while building his life from nothing, working the legal system court date by court date, trying to reach his daughter. That story is real. But the parallel story is that during every one of those years, Bailee was inside an active addiction household, navigating a childhood no child should have to navigate, waiting for the situation to change. It changed in 2016. That year, Jelly Roll was playing a small venue in Las Vegas when he met a woman named Elisa, known publicly as Bunny XO. Their relationship moved fast. They got married at a Las Vegas courthouse in late August of 2016, and almost immediately together they started pushing harder on the custody situation. The legal process to move Bailee into their full-time care was completed in 2017. She was 8 years old. Jelly Roll has been open about the role Bunny XO played in making that happen. He has said plainly that he could not have won that custody case without her. Before he had any significant income from music, she had personally helped fund the legal costs of the fight. The woman who would later build her own public career as a podcast host had poured her own resources into bringing a child she had not yet known for a full year into a stable home. Bunny XO has talked about that role in her own words too. She has consistently called herself a bonus mom rather than a replacement mother. She has said that Bailee began calling her mom by her own choice, not because anyone asked her to. She has been clear, across years of interviews and social media posts, that what she is to Bailee is not something that came with a label or a legal document. It came with years of showing up. And Bailee has confirmed this. On the Dumb Blonde podcast, speaking about her stepmother, she was not performing gratitude for an audience. She was describing a relationship that had become the most stable, most consistent maternal presence in her life. The woman who had come into the picture when she was 8 years old, who had driven the legal process that brought her home, and who had given her version of a normal childhood that she had not had before, had become her mom in every way that mattered. When Bailee moved in full-time, Jelly Roll and Bunny XO made a deliberate choice about how to raise her. They kept her in the same public school district she was already in. She stayed in the same neighborhood, same friends, same teachers, same routines. When the music career exploded and the money changed and the fame arrived, none of that filtered into Bailee's daily life in ways that disrupted what they had built. She did not move to a private school. She did not change districts. The stability was treated as the priority, and they protected it with a kind of intentionality that does not happen by accident. In 2020, when Bailee was 10 years old, she did something that speaks to exactly who she was becoming even then. She sat down with her father and told him she wanted to write a song. She has since described songwriting as a form of therapy for her, a way to process things she did not have another outlet for. The song she and Jelly Roll wrote together was called Tears Could Talk. It was released on his album that year, credited as a collaboration between the two of them. The song was about Felicia, about what Bailee had witnessed, about what it felt like to grow up watching someone you loved disappear into something you could not reach. Jelly Roll has been careful to let Bailee speak for herself about that song when she chooses to. But he has talked about the writing process, and he has said he was struck by how clearly she understood what she was processing at 10 years old, and how much of the lyrical work was genuinely hers rather than borrowed from him. 3 years later, in the summer of 2023, Jelly Roll was in the middle of his Backroad Baptism tour. He was performing in Georgia in front of a stadium crowd when he stopped mid-show to tell the audience that his 15-year-old daughter was with him that night. He told them she had written a song years earlier, a song about finding healing through music. And then Bailee walked out on stage and performed it in front of thousands of people. Every account of that moment, from people in the audience and from Bailee herself in later interviews, points to the same thing. This was her choice. She was not pushed into the spotlight. She was not doing it for content or for her father's brand or for a narrative anyone was trying to sell. She chose to be up there. She had been writing since she was 10 years old as a private act of survival, and now she was choosing to make it public. That distinction matters, because the girl who walked onto that stage in Georgia was not performing someone else's story. She was standing inside her own. But what that audience in Georgia did not know, and what almost nobody outside the family knew at that point, was that the summer Bailee was performing on that stage was the year after the worst stretch of her young life. And the story of that stretch, in her own words, did not become public until she told it herself that in the summer of 2022. Bailee was 14 years old. Felicia had gone through periods of attempted recovery over the years. That particular summer, she was in what Bailee later described as a sober period. And Bailee, with the hope that only a daughter who has not yet given up can carry, chose to spend part of that summer with her mother. The relapse happened during those months. Bailee has described it in specific, unflinching terms on the Dumb Blonde podcast. Her mother introduced her to marijuana, then alcohol, then other substances in ways that no 14-year-old should ever encounter from a parent. The woman who was supposed to be in recovery had pulled her own daughter into the relapse instead of using the presence of that daughter as a reason to hold on. The breaking point, Bailee has said, came on the 4th of July. She got into the car with Felicia. Her mother mentioned, in the casual tone that made the moment into something Bailee would carry for years, that they needed to stop somewhere first. She was taking her daughter to her dealer, sitting in that passenger seat at 14 years old. Bailee said she understood in that moment that whatever she had been holding onto about her mother's recovery was gone. There was nothing left to hope for from that direction. She came home to her father and Bunny XO at the end of the summer in a state of crisis that went deeper than the summer's events. Because what she also disclosed on the podcast, something she had not shared publicly before, was that she had been quietly struggling with her mental health for years. Depression, compounding grief, self-medication, things that had been building underneath the surface long before that summer, and that the summer of 2022 had finally brought to a head. Jelly Roll and Bunny XO made a call. They enrolled Bailee in a residential wilderness therapy program designed for adolescents in crisis. The program was structured around approximately 8 weeks of intensive therapeutic work in a wilderness environment, away from screens and social media and the daily rhythms of normal life. Bailee stayed nearly 9 weeks. She extended her own stay voluntarily after her parents came to visit her because she felt she needed more time. That decision was hers. Nobody kept her there. She chose more. When she came home, she did something that takes most people far longer to arrive at. She decided to cut Felicia out of her life entirely. Not as a punishment. Not in anger. As a survival decision made by someone who had tried every available version of having a relationship with her mother and arrived, through painful experience, at the conclusion that she could not afford to keep trying. She was 14 going on 15. She made that call herself. And then in February of 2024, at 15 years old, she sat down on her stepmother's podcast and told all of it to the world. The episode of Dumb Blonde titled Bailee and Strength and Healing was released on February 21st, 2024. Bunny XO hosted. Bailee talked for the entire episode without glossing over anything. She walked through the timeline of her mother's addiction. She described the house she grew up in. She talked about her grandmother working to hold things together in an environment that was collapsing around her. She talked about the periods when Felicia was incarcerated and the cautious reconnections that followed. She talked about the summer of 2022 in detail. She talked about the wilderness therapy program, about her own depression and anger, about the self-medication she had engaged in during the worst period. And then she said something that landed differently than everything else. She said, speaking about her mother, that in her view Felicia was without a soul. She did not say it with venom. She did not say it to be dramatic. She said it with a particular kind of flatness that comes from someone who has thought about a thing for years and has finally arrived at a place where they no longer need to dress it up to make it easier for other people to hear. This was not a teenager lashing out. This was a teenager who had done the work, had been through treatment, had made decisions about her own life, and was now telling the truth about what she had seen. The episode was streamed millions of times. Clips spread across every major platform. People who had only ever heard the polished version of Jelly Roll's family story were suddenly hearing a completely different account from the person who had actually lived inside it. Here is what is worth pausing on, though. Not a single word of that episode was about Jelly Roll being a bad father. Not a single moment in it placed the blame for her childhood on him. What Bailee exposed on that podcast was her mother. What she described was Felicia's addiction, Felicia's choices, what Felicia failed to provide, and what those failures cost her. And in the process of doing that, almost without trying, she made something visible about her father that no amount of interviews or award show speeches ever could. She showed who had actually shown up, not by praising him, not by defending him, but by describing, in concrete terms, what her early life looked like before he got her home, and then implicitly by being, at 15 years old, the kind of person she had become. A teenager who could sit across from a microphone and narrate her own survival with that level of clarity, detail, and emotional intelligence does not arrive there without someone having done the right things in the years that mattered. 9 months after that podcast episode, Bailee returned to Dumb Blonde. She was 16 by then. The first conversation had been about survival. The second one was about the future. And what she laid out was not a teenager's daydream. It was a plan. She told Bunny XO she wanted to go to Columbia University. She wanted to study law, specifically criminal defense. She talked about her reasoning carefully, noting the one category of defendant she felt she could not represent, while making clear that otherwise she wanted to work inside the criminal justice system as a defense attorney. She talked about wanting to change how that system operates, and said that the most effective way to do that was from the inside. She mentioned becoming a judge. She mentioned becoming a congresswoman. She mentioned that she had considered running for president. For a 16-year-old, this conversation had a register that was noticeably different from the way teenagers usually talk about the future. She was not fantasizing out loud. She had clearly already spent real time thinking about what each pathway required and what it would make possible. She talked about her grades, which by her father's account are among the highest at her high school. She mentioned that she was already dual enrolled in college courses as a junior, meaning she was taking actual university classes while still in high school. She also addressed her father's fame directly. She said that she and her friends had basically gotten used to it. He came to her football games. The novelty had faded. The kids at her school had stopped treating it as unusual. What this suggests is that whatever Jelly Roll's career looked like from the outside, from the inside of Bailee's daily life, it was background information, not the defining feature of who she was or how she was understood by the people around her. She made one more thing clear in that episode. She had no interest in following her father into music. She said it without hesitation. The songwriting had been therapeutic when she was younger, a tool she had needed at a specific point in her development. As a teenager, she had moved past it. Her path was law. The courtroom, not the studio. For the daughter of a Grammy-nominated country artist to say that on her stepmother's podcast without a moment of hesitation is itself a kind of declaration. She was not going to be defined by her father's industry or her father's fame. She was going to build something of her own in a field she had chosen for reasons that had nothing to do with who her father was. Jelly Roll, for his part, has spoken about Bailee in public in ways that are different from the way celebrity parents typically talk about their children. He does not lean on her for emotional content. He does not use her for sympathy. He does not frame her primarily as the thing that saved him, even though he has said in various contexts that she was part of what motivated his recovery. When he talks about her, he tends to talk about her as a person, with specific attributes and specific accomplishments that have nothing to do with his story that he told People magazine in late 2020 that she was emotionally intelligent in a way he had never been at her age. He said she could read a room better than most adults he knew. He described a conversation where she had tried to talk her way out of getting grounded, and he had told her that she was too smart to try to use his past against him. He said it with affection and with honest self-awareness about the difference between who he had been at 16 and who she was at the same age.